Welcome to De-Risky Business, the economic security podcast from the Center for New American Security in Washington, D.C. I'm your co-host, Emily Kilcrease.
And I'm your other co-host, Geoff Gertz. After a short break over the holidays, De-Risky Business is back for 2025.
That's right, we took a break over the holidays, had a couple of snow days, which were delightful, and as I like to remind people, if you think the United States can take over Canada, you should see how D.C. reacts to a few inches of snow, and then let me know what you think.
That's right. It's not a pretty scenario here with just a couple inches on the ground. But anyways, we are kicking off this year with a fantastic discussion with Paul Scharre, who's a leading expert on AI and national security, and as it happens, is also our boss here at CNAS. So we talk with Paul about the Biden administration's new AI diffusion rule, asking whether the United States can use export controls to limit the global spread of frontier AI.
The AI diffusion rule, candidly, it's another huge play by the outgoing Biden administration to shape future tech competition, sets up this enormous new global regime to control who gets advanced AI chips. It is almost certain to cause heartburn in pretty much the rest of the world. So Geoff, Paul, and I dig into the rule, including all of the very complicated layers of restrictions and exceptions to the exceptions and restrictions on the exceptions. It is very, very complicated. But Geoff, do you know who I think actually explains this rule and the likely reaction from the rest of the world the best?
Who's that?
It's Katy Perry.
All right, explain that one, Emily.
I thought it was obvious, but I'll explain, which is that, of course, listeners who are familiar with Katy Perry will remember her seminal 2008 song, Hot and Cold. And in case you're not familiar, I'll go ahead and share some of the lyrics.
Just imagine I'm not familiar.
Yeah. I will not sing, but it's because you're hot, then you're cold. You're yes, then you're no. You're in, then you're out. You're up, then you're down. You're wrong, but it's right. It's black, and it's white. We fight, we break up, we kiss, we make up. And I honestly cannot think of a better way to sum up how the U.S. allies will react to this rule.
That's right. I think we're going to hear some Katy Perry lyrics coming from Europe coming soon. Maybe next time we'll get her on the podcast to go into it. But, we're going to have this great wide-ranging discussion with Paul, covering everything from what is an AI model weight, how are cutting-edge semiconductors kind of like enriched uranium and how they should be controlled the same way, and why this new regime can be thought of as an America-first approach to regulating global AI.
It's good to be back. De-Risky Business is supported in part by Amazon and through general support to the CNAS Energy, Economics, and Security Program. So today on De-Risky Business, we are really excited to have Paul Scharre join us to talk about this new AI diffusion rule released by the Department of Commerce earlier this week. So Paul Scharre is the Director of Studies here at CNAS. He is our boss. We will see if he likes us doing a podcast by the time we get to the end of the podcast, or if he starts to question his management decisions. But Paul, in addition to being our boss, is also one of the world's best experts on AI, particularly military AI. His most recent book is called Battlegrounds, talking about all of the geopolitical competition issues related to AI. So super excited to have you on the podcast, Paul.
Well, thank you, Emily and Geoff, for having me. I'm excited to be on the hottest new podcast in Washington.
So hot.
All right, so before we really get into the nuts and bolts of the new diffusion rule, I wanted to start by taking a step back. We're hearing a lot about national security concerns on AI lately. It seems like this is the kind of hot new topic for sure. You've been thinking about these issues for a long time. Can you kind of explain a little bit more, big picture, what's at stake here on national security concerns with AI?
Yeah, I think, the fundamental thing that's driving these concerns is that we are at a place now where AI is starting to have a significance as a technology that is a strategically relevant technology, that is in a different category than how we might think about, say, the competition with Huawei over 5G or other technology competitions, where if your mental model of AI is ChatGPT from 2 years ago, it's continued to get better. We are now really at the place where the best AI models are starting to surpass human performance in some really significant domains like coding, mathematics, chemistry, biology, physics. And there's a lot of potentially really significant implications there for cybersecurity, for bioweapons development, for basic fundamental research, which could be very dual use, that the U.S. government wants to make sure the U.S. stays in the lead on.
And so this is about catastrophic risks. I think there's some debate on sort of, how real is the set of catastrophic risks versus this kind of AI is just going to be foundational to geopolitical competition, and so we want to make sure we're in the lead there.
Yeah, I think the questions around catastrophic risk are probably still open. There are reasons for concern. The analogy I would make there might be that when GPT-2 first came out in 2019, OpenAI raised the alarm, as did some other researchers, about its potential for disinformation. It wasn't very good. And it was fair to criticize GPT-2 as like, who's really going to be fooled by this? And there were some tests that people might mistake it for human-generated text, but it really wasn't very impressive. Fast forward 4 years to GPT-4, and GPT-4 had human-level performance across a whole wide range of domains. And now we're in a world where AI-generated text is a very real concern when we think about disinformation. And we're in a similar place today with some of these concerns about catastrophic risk, bioweapons development being really, I think, one of the more concerning ones, where I would say it's more like kind of a proof of concept, that we've seen some tests that demonstrate that large language models could help people, maybe, in developing steps towards making biological weapons. We're not at the place where, it's like jumping up and down, screaming, shut it all down. But progress is moving forward rapidly. So that is a potential concern. But the geopolitical ones about competition are also very, very real. And I think that alone is a significant driver behind what we're seeing.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate kind of how fast this technology is moving. Even just in our team, as we were looking through this very complex AI diffusion rule, a bunch of us were playing with the AI tools available to answer some very specific technical questions. And I was like shocked and terrified by how good some of the answers were, which raises a whole other set of catastrophic and existential questions for us as think tank analysts, candidly. But it was pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, I used Google Deep Research at Notebook LM to try to parse through all these hundreds of pages of rules. And they're pretty good at actually pulling things out. It's okay, explain this aspect of the rule to me. So it's impressive. And that just wasn't true even, honestly, like 6 months ago in terms of some of these tools.
Mm-hmm. So before we dig into the details of the rule, which we will do, it's worth unpacking. It's pretty complicated, and there's some pretty profound policy shifts that are included in the rule. Probably worth just a quick run through of like how we got to this point in the policy space. So the technology is moving very quickly. The geopolitical competition, particularly with China, is continuing to heat up and is a big focus for policymakers in DC. This is, of course, not the first time that the Biden administration has tried to use export controls as a way to make sure that the U.S. stays ahead of China here, right? So if you want the quick history of this policy evolution, date that back to fall of 2022. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, gave this now sort of famous speech about how the Biden administration was going to proceed with its tech competition strategy. He sets out the vision that the United States wants to maintain as large a lead as possible in these force multiplier technologies. And there was a big focus in that speech on particularly AI and the computing power needed for AI. We quickly saw that, followed by the first round of really serious export controls in October of 2022 that basically, again, hundreds of pages of text, which we will not read out loud here, but the basic idea of that initial round of controls was that we don't want advanced AI chips going to China. We also don't want China to be able to indigenously make AI chips, so we are going to cut off the tooling necessary for China to develop those sorts of AI chips domestically. We saw another round of rules come out in 2023, where clearly the administration was like, okay, we figured out the direct export to China problem, but now we also realize that there's a whole bunch of other countries around the world, particularly in the Gulf, that are starting to build out AI capability, data center infrastructure, and China could probably access similar computing capability through the cloud, through a service arrangement. And so they expanded controls to get at that group of countries to try to cut off that avenue. So this has really been kind of a snowball effect of policy development and iteration to try to keep pace with the evolving ways that compute power for AI capabilities can become available.
Yeah, exactly. I think, Paul, as you were just saying, we see AI capabilities advancing very rapidly. We see the kind of U.S. government response kind of moving step by step, I think, to try and match it. As we, again, are looking forward to this idea of kind of diffusion and kind of controlling worldwide spread of AI capabilities, I do think the G42 Microsoft deal is a kind of precursor for where this is going. And this is the deal, I think a lot of our listeners will probably remember, we talked about this kind of a couple months ago, I think, on the podcast, But essentially, where the U.S. government came up with a system to allow Microsoft to work with G42 in the UAE to build a big data center there, and kind of face this fundamental question of, we want to bring these sort of third countries, these swing states around the world into the U.S. tech ecosystem, but we have this risk that, as we are controlling China's access to compute, are they then just going to sort of remotely access these same things through data centers in kind of third countries around the world, particularly as the Gulf is making a big push to kind of increase their own capabilities here. So again, the sort of reporting that's come out on Microsoft G42, there's sort of lots of back and forth between the US government, the UAE government, Microsoft, and G42 on sort of going through what are all the security requirements that need to be in place to have this data center approved. What does the UAE government need to sign on to in terms of kind of taking Huawei out of a lot of its systems? And, it seems to sort of, up to Secretary Raimondo herself being very heavily involved in these negotiations. And that kind of finally got to a deal. But I also think it's clear that's not sort of replicable as a global model to be doing these sort of like one-off negotiations for every data center that's getting built in this kind of boom time. So I think that kind of brings us to now of saying like, all right, we've got some sense of what are these set of controls and kind of requirements we would want to have to allow AI spread to other countries, but how can we build that into a more sustainable, kind of comprehensive global system?
Yeah, exactly. So let's unpack what this rule does, the structure of the rule. It's very complicated, and we can start with like what's the policy objective that the administration is trying to achieve? I mean, they call it the AI Diffusion rule, which is very sweet sounding. It sounds like a room freshener or something. I think it's an intentional branding effort where they're trying to say like, we have serious concerns about these chips going to China. We have serious concerns about diversion, but we want to let this technology out and about. We want the world to have it. But when you actually unpack the rule, which we're about to do, it's clear that that's not
a bit more of an AI restriction rule than an AI diffusion rule, I would say.
But. I mean, or like benign dictator rule. Like it's just like there's a lot going on here, and it seems like one of the undercurrents of this rule really is like, yes, the U.S. wants AI capabilities, advanced AI capabilities, to be able to spread, but like only a little bit. And actually, they mostly want to keep it in the United States. So there's we'll get into this, but like there's a heavy element of this whole policy that's really about providing incentives and regulatory sticks or carrots, whatever you want to call them, to build out the most critical AI infrastructure in the United States. Okay, so let's unpack the rule. So first off, we should be clear, what kind of chips are we actually talking about here? So Paul, you look at this a lot. Like we say advanced AI chips, but what does that actually mean?
Right. So the rule actually doesn't change the threshold for chips that are covered. And so the chips that the U.S. government's been going after, and they've made some tweaks to the performance threshold, but really since October 22, are advanced chips, graphics processing units, GPUs, that are optimized for training AI models. They're designed in such a way that they're extremely effective for training AI models. Now, what's interesting, and I want to give a lot of credit to the folks in government for moving quickly on this issue and continue to be flexible, but there is a big time lag in terms of how the government's able to respond to developments in the technology, because there was a huge breakthrough this fall that came out with AI progress on inference, on when the neural network is running. And there are different chips that are very effective, that are not captured by the export controls in the previous regulations or this one. And so, for example, the NVIDIA H20 that's still permitted for export to China, now much more strategically relevant in the last couple of months as we've seen this huge growth in performance when AI models are using more computing power at inference when they're running. And that's still not captured, or that's going to be something that really is going to be left to the Trump administration to tackle.
Why do you think they didn't capture the inference? I mean, they had a big rule coming out. There was an opportunity.
My guess is they weren't able to get there in terms of timing. I think they're aware of this kind of breakthrough, but I think it really didn't come out publicly till the fall. And so my suspicion would be that it's just a question of the time that it takes for them to really flesh out all the details of these rules and informally socialize them and then get to a decision.
And just follow up there, do you have a sense on those chips? It's obviously a big part of the existing controls of those chips that sort of only the U.S. can make at the moment, and sort of China's maybe catching up a little bit, but seems at least a few years behind. On these sort of H20, are they, how much of that capacity is in China now, and what type of time lag do we have there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. Right now, we're still in a place where the the chips, there are chips that are controlled that only can be made using U.S. technology. That's a TSMC. Of course, the chips aren't made right here. I think one of the bigger challenges with this shift to inference time compute is, one, you don't need a model that is trained with as much computing power. And so you can take a model that doesn't need as much compute for training and then run more compute at inference time and still get really significant performance gains. And so this sort of shifts the balance of where we're using the computing power. It's going to make it easier for people to then reach up to higher level AI capabilities with probably net less computing power. And then there's a question of, like, as we see the landscape of chip design evolve, while of course the chip manufacturing is highly concentrated in Taiwan, the design space is much wider, right? And there are a lot of serious Chinese companies in chip design. And so I think we're going to continue to see Chinese chip developers push the boundaries of what they can do in the design space, limited as they are going to be in terms of domestic manufacturing. And I think very much an open question how far they'll be able to push that, and whether they'll be able to have some chips that are more effective because of innovations in design.
So 2 other details on the types of chips included, just to kind of round this out. So we can't forget about one of our favorite export control quirks, which is the foreign direct product rule. So we're not just talking about US made chips, we're talking about chips literally anywhere in the world because of this extraterritorial application that is put onto these rules, right? So it's a big control. But there's also an exception that's been baked in for the last couple rounds of rules for gaming GPUs that are just for gaming. So they're not designed for data center use. So it's a complicated rule even when we're just talking about initial product coverage. But it gets more complicated. So Geoff, walk us through a little bit the structure of the AI diffusion rule. Basically, there's like these worldwide controls that are imposed, or control being like a licensing requirement, which gives the United States the hook to, again, regulate pretty much every advanced AI chip that is made in the world today. But there's also a lot of ways to get out of the licensing requirement. So how does that all work?
Yeah, so this is where we see the real big change in this rule. So again, I think, as we've been talking a lot, there's been a number of controls really focused on China, so either sort of directly on China. Again, we saw, in October 2023, the expansion to sort of another couple dozen countries with really focus on the risk of diversion to China. Where this rule kind of breaks from that, and I would say it's kind of qualitatively different from the rules we've seen before, is that this is a new global regime. So this is not saying we are just focused on kind of the risk of the chips getting to sort of the bad guys, as it were. This is sort of what is the global vision for where AI is going to be produced and run in the years ahead. And so what the rule does, it divides the world into 3 groups of countries. So at the top of the list, maybe you've got the United States and our closest allies. We've got, I think, 18 countries that are in this tier 1. And for these countries, there's pretty minimal restrictions. So for them, more or less, business as usual will continue. At the other end, you've got, again, sort of arms embargo countries, sort of China and a handful of other countries. Again, for these groups, chips were already controlled to them, so it's not going to be that big a difference immediately in what they see in this rule. But the big difference is for the middle tier, which is every other country in the world, which now falls into, again, what the rule talks about as being this tier 2 of sort of middle countries for whom there's now a big new set of restrictions. And again, this is a very large number of countries, not the U.S.'s sort of closest allies in terms of who's in the tier 1 group, but they're sort of, that tier 1 is very restricted. So countries, Israel, there's kind of 15 different European countries that do not make that tier 1. So there are a lot of countries that now find themselves in this sort of middle ground tier 2 who are going to have real questions.
Yeah, and certainly some of those kind of middle countries are countries where there is a real desire and capacity to build out some of this AI data infrastructure, right? So you've got Singapore is going to be in that bucket. You've got Malaysia in that bucket. You've got Brazil, India, right? So you've got plus half of Europe, which can't forget about that, right? Like that is like fairly significant that like a lot of European countries did not make the cut. Some NATO allies did not make the cut here, right? So that middle group, it's not a toss-away group. It's pretty significant.
Yeah, and I think this really gets to, do you view this as a AI restriction rule or an AI diffusion rule, as like what happens in these middle countries? So as we say, they now face a set of restrictions that they didn't before, but the rule also bakes in multiple different pathways to allow chips to flow to these countries. So to begin with, there's just sort of a low volume exception. So if you're not importing tons of kind of most advanced H100s, those can kind of continue to go by without any restrictions. There's then this novel validated end user program that they're setting up. And again, it's really complicated. We're not going to get sort of too far into the weeds here. But essentially, you'll see both kind of big hyperscaler companies based in the United States and allies that can be universal validated end users who can basically build these data centers in any of the tier 2 countries without restriction. You also have a separate national validated end user, which has a bit more restrictions on it for companies that are based in the tier 2 countries and want to build there. So your kind of G42s, for instance. So there are multiple different paths that countries will have to get to these chips. But it is a big new regulatory requirement that didn't exist before.
Okay, we'll come back to this question of, specifically what are those requirements in order to get the validated end user? Like there's a huge policy shift in here around country caps and geographic allocations that we will talk about. But let's first kind of round out the baseline level of the rules, and let's talk about the model weight controls, right? So this is another new element in the AI diffusion rule where they, for the first time, impose controls on model weight. So explain to us what is a model weight, why does it matter, and what's the control?
Yeah, so model weights are really the kind of key to sort of these advanced AI. So it's the sort of secret sauce, if you will, in a lot of advanced AI. And so, we've seen from the Biden administration a number of recent actions on kind of controlling the most sort of frontier AI models, where they've drawn this threshold of 10 to the 26 computing power flops, that they are saying kind of anything trained above that level qualifies as sort of frontier AI that needs to be controlled. And so this sort of extends that threshold into the export control space and says, if you have model weights for training models on sort of, again, this 10 to the 26 threshold, those will be controlled. Again, you've got a similar exception for the group of 18 countries. You also have quite a big exception for open source models. Anything that is open source is not covered by this. And they're sort of built into the rule, this idea that, as the most powerful open source models kind of become more and more powerful and kind of move closer towards kind of the current existing frontier, that will sort of naturally raise the cap of what is controlled. But this is another big change and something that the US government has not done before.
Paul, maybe for you, can you explain for us, like non-AI tech experts, like the model weight is, what is the algorithm? It's how does it interact with the data? Like what is a model weight?
What is a model weight?
Yeah.
And why do we care? And here's the thing. So, and the term is not at all intuitive to what it is, because it's like you're not physically weighing anything, right? So what the model is, an AI model, in this case, is a giant neural network. And the essence of, so it's not lines of code of if-then statements, the way you would think of traditional software. It's this big network, and the essence of the network is a series of numbers that are referred to as parameters that basically define at each artificial neuron in this network, then how information flows through it. And so some networks having stronger connections than others. That's where the term weight comes from. It's sort of the weight of these connections inside the network. And the training process uses large amounts of computing power and data to then churn through data and to tweak the weights of these connections, to make some connections stronger and some weaker, to in effect make the neural network smarter so you get better output at the end. Well, the output of this training process is then this set of numbers, the model weights, that represents effectively the model itself. Like the model is the model weights. And so the data and the computing chips are the raw material that goes into the training process. And the output of all of this is the model weights. And so if you're trying to control AI, it makes sense to control the chips. That's a really essential raw input that you need. But the actual is the model weights. Like that's the thing at the end. And so it actually logically makes a lot of sense that you would want to control that. But it is new. It's a big paradigm shift. And one of the challenges is not physically controllable the way chips are. It's just software. So you can have this training process that uses 100,000 chips and takes months, and yet the output is this model, this set of model weights, that's really just a piece of software that you could pop onto a hard drive and move around. It's way more portable, which makes, of course, enforcing these controls is going to be more difficult.
Yeah, one of the real concerns is sort of, once the model weights are out in the world, the horse left the barn, right? There's no way to kind of pull them back in that sense. I think it will be a real enforcement question on how can you have export control process around this sort of, you slip by once and they kind of have access to it. So it's going to be tough.
Right. It's a valuable piece of intellectual property, but that's what it is. It's not physical hardware the same way these chips are.
So one of the issues we want to dig into, one of the areas that's pretty controversial about the AI diffusion rule is this idea of country caps, right? So through the rule, the US is trying to say you can have chips, but like only up to a certain amount. And actually we want most of that AI infrastructure to stay in the United States. As Geoff, as you talked about, like the good guys are not subject to, the countries on the good guys list are not subject to strict quotas or geographical allocations, although there's a little bit of a twist there, right? Which is that for the US or good guys headquartered companies who want to take advantage of the universal validated end user status, right? So these are going to be like the hyperscalers, the companies that don't want to have to come in for many licenses a year. In order to get that status, they actually have to agree to a specific geographic allocation of their compute infrastructure. And it's a not insignificant allocation, right? Like, so 50% of their computing power has to stay in the United States. An additional 25% can go outside the United States if it's to one of the countries on this good guy list. An additional 7% can go to the middle list, and of course, none of this can go to China. So that's a pretty big condition that these big companies are going to have to agree to. In addition to that, for the middle group of countries, there's just a straight up country cap, as well as like a separate validated end user process that has its own set of by country cap. Like this thing has layers to it, right? So clearly, when you package that all together, what the US is trying to do, if you ask the administration folks what they're trying to do, they're saying that, well, they're really trying to build in incentives and kind of drive corporate entities into a more secure compute infrastructure. And I think that's right, but like also they want most of that to be in the United States.
Yeah, and I think, this is where we get to Geoff's comment earlier about, is it the AI diffusion rule or is it the AI restriction rule? Because if all you wanted to do was just diffuse AI capabilities, some of this you would probably have. You'd have different tiering of countries, and you'd have the validated end user requirements. But then the caps is where the restriction really starts to come into play. And the caps are complicated, and there's a bunch of caps for different people. I think conceptually, why do we care about this? Because this is a bit of a paradigm shift for how we would think about technology export controls. Normally, we might say, okay, look, you can have the technology or not, right? We trust you or we don't. So why is, in this case, we're saying, okay, you can have an advanced AI chip, you can have an NVIDIA H100, but only up to a certain amount. And I think the fundamental thing here, and this is different than, say, how you might think about a missile or a night vision goggle, is that right now we're seeing a huge qualitative shift in AI performance when you have very large numbers of chips. And so there's this sort of scaling effect when you're scaling up data and computing power, where it unlocks new AI capabilities. You can do things with AI with 100,000 chips that you cannot do with 10,000 chips. And so it's maybe loosely analogous to how we think in a very different but critically important strategic technology about inputs to nuclear weapons, right? And so for enriched uranium, we care about the amount in which you've enriched uranium. 5% enrichment for a civilian nuclear reactor is very different qualitatively than 90% highly enriched uranium that's weapons grade. And so the degree of something then leads to this huge difference in terms of qualitatively what you can do. Realize that's a contentious analogy here, but I think what we are talking about is something where the degree of chips matters a lot. And what the US is trying to do is say, we want other countries to have access to sovereign computing resources, but we want the very best AI to still be made here in the US and trained here in the US. And that's what these caps are effectively doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a huge policy shift, right? To go from this binary yes or no, you can have it or you can't have it, to where you're actually saying, no, the allocation, the volume is actually like what crosses our risk threshold or not. So Paul, when you look at the caps as they're baked into the rule and all of their glorious manifestations, like what is your sense of like where those levels are set today? Like, are they really restrictive? Are they actually going to allow for emerging AI capabilities in other countries, particularly in that critical middle group?
Well, the caps are actually really high. So there are different caps for different actors, and U.S. hyperscalers have different limits than, say, these national validated end users in other countries. But let's just take the national validated end users. So another country has a company, they want to import these export-controlled chips. The limit right now in 2027 will be 320,000 H100 equivalent chips. Now that's equivalent to, in today's dollars, an $8 billion investment. And that's permitted. You couldn't go beyond that. So that's actually a lot. It gives countries a lot of headroom, at least in the next couple of years, to build out sovereign computing resources. But yeah, it is saying the U.S. is going to keep for itself the most advanced AI.
Yeah. And again, I think it's worth mentioning briefly here, at least, those national VEU do come with a number of restrictions. There's a bunch of kind of very reasonable kind of security restrictions that I think anybody worried about catastrophic risk makes sense to have. But there's also a real part of this that is saying you need to opt into the U.S. tech system and out of the China tech system if you want to be a national VEU. So lots of things, you need to comply with the U.S. outbound investment rules. So kind of, non-Americans need to sign on to all the restrictions that the Treasury Department is kind of enforcing on Americans on outbound outbound investments in the Chinese tech sector. You kind of, again, won't be able to have Huawei parts in your ecosystem. So there's a real kind of security push that I think is probably not that controversial. Anybody kind of running a giant data center with hundreds of thousands of H100s, we'd want to have those security controls in place. I would be very curious to see how different national VEUs or sort of potential national VEUs weigh that balance between how much do I have to give up, and is it worth it for me as a in the global south kind of company working on this? Is that a bet I'm willing to take? Is the trade-off worth it?
Yeah, and there's another angle here too, which is that this whole policy is set up to really incentivize and kind of force that infrastructure into the United States. But is the United States ready to build AI infrastructure at this scale, right?
Yeah, no, I do. I mean, I wonder if one of the most impactful parts of this rule will actually be the requirement that US-based universal validated end users, again, the big kind of hyperscalers, will need to have 50% of their total capacity in the United States. So, basically saying for every data center the kind of Googles and Microsofts and AWSs are building outside in the world, they also need to build one in the US. It's an interesting format. I think, as you're saying, we've never really seen export controls used in this way to sort of incentivize home production. And I think there's a real question of, we'll be able to keep up on, the permitting, the energy, all of the sets of issues here in order to kind of allow that domestic production to take place.
Well, and the Biden administration has an answer for that, or at least a preliminary answer on their way out the door, which is the new executive order on AI that is aimed at least to, I would characterize it as some early steps in this direction, that there are a lot of challenges in terms of the land use, the energy requirements for these data center build-outs in the years ahead that we can see is going to be needed for these trends to continue, the energy generation and power transmission. The executive order touches on a couple components of this, making federal land held by Department of Defense and Department of Energy available for lease by private entities to build out these data centers and energy behind them, which is great. There's going to be a lot more that I think the Trump administration is going to have to pick up to actually actualize this, right? Yeah. If we want the U.S. to stay ahead, the other side of the coin here is the U.S. has to be then pedal to the floor in terms of building out these data centers and the energy behind them.
Yeah, absolutely. It just makes the sort of stakes of this bigger in the global competition, which is that, if we are too slow in building out our own domestic capacity, not only is that a problem in itself, but then it's also going to constrain hyperscalers from expanding globally, and they're going to be kind of squeezed that way as well. So stakes are high.
All right, so all simple stuff, easy peasy lemon squeezy, guys. This is great. All right, let's. I wanted to come back to the model weights question, because there's one piece of this debate that we haven't really gotten into, which is this question of open source AI models versus closed source AI models. And the administration is making a decision in this rule about how it's imposing controls on the model weights for closed models, but not for open models. So Paul, walk us through what's this debate about open versus closed? Why is any of this open? From a strict security perspective, that does sound crazy, but obviously there's some reasons for that. And kind of what's your take on how they've approached this issue?
Yeah, all right, maybe it's worth a little bit of just a history here. So the AI research community used to be incredibly open, with people publishing papers, releasing models and data sets online, sharing them through online repositories like GitHub, allowing people to download and access. And that's been great for scientific research and for AI development. As we've seen the technology have just some much more real-world business applications, and some of these models are extremely expensive to buy these large numbers of chips and train them. We're talking about, for the most advanced models, on the order of like $100 million to train one of these things. Then some of the leading companies have become more closed. And you can go access Claude from Anthropic, or ChatGPT from OpenAI, or Gemini from Google, but you can't get the model weights itself. They're not giving up the actual model. Now, Meta's in a different position. They've been releasing very capable open source models. They're a Llama family. And so, that's great for the broader research community. It allows other people to catch up, broaden the playing field. It also means that others can get access to this. And we've seen reporting that the Chinese military has been using Meta's Llama family of models and building on them, at least for research applications. And so there's this huge debate about open source, particularly given concerns that future AI systems might be able to enable really nasty sort of things, like people making biological weapons. Well, is that something you really want to open source? Again, not there today. This just doesn't tackle it. It totally kicks the can down the road on that debate. And so you have this weird rule in the regulation where the model is export controlled above a certain threshold of computing power, the 10 to the 26 flop, unless someone open sources the model, and then any model, that one and anything else that's of equivalent size in terms of computing power, is then available, right? And it's not export controlled. And so the open sourcing becomes this like weird get out of jail free card around all these regulations, where you could have a situation where a company trains a model, it's export controlled, and they're not allowed to export according to all these regulations, and then they just open source it. And then none of this applies. And so logically, that doesn't make a lot of sense, in the sense that if a model's really sensitive, it should be export controlled, then maybe we shouldn't put it on the internet for anyone to get access to. But this just doesn't address that. And that's something that we'll have to see the next administration pick up.
Yeah, I mean, is there a commercial incentive here that if you're a company, you're pouring billions and bajillions of dollars into like developing these models, like you actually don't want to open source it because you're seeking to monetize it, right? Like, to me, it makes a lot of sense why companies would keep it closed, and I don't understand why Meta would make it open. Like, how do they make money off of an open source model?
Yeah, so the logic behind Google and Anthropic and OpenAI not releasing their models makes all the sense in the world, right? Meta's strategy is a little bit different. I guess the speculation here, right, and this is my interpretation, is that Meta's models are a little bit further behind, and by releasing it open source, they basically undercut their competitors and level the playing field. And they're taking away their advantage, and then Meta is basically putting this model out that allows everybody else to build on their infrastructure, giving them this advantage that they can harness kind of the broader research community, which is, it is beneficial to everyone else. I mean, it's not great for society to see this concentration of power in a handful of companies. The problem is we're also in many ways then giving away the crown jewels of U.S. technology to our strategic competitors, to China.
I would say from a structure of the export control sense, it's an interesting way to kind of set the threshold. So basically what this means is that effectively wherever the most advanced open source model is, that's the current threshold for what's controlled, and that will sort of move by itself over time. Because I think one of the challenges we've seen the administration face here on the kind of chips generally, but sort of somewhere on the models themselves and the model weights, is how do you adjust to these rapidly changing new technologies? And we see kind of come back and say, like, all right, cover these chips, cover a new set of chips. Kind of, are they going to keep on putting out new 200-page rules every time to kind of capture additional new chip that comes on the market? This seems to be a way to like try and build in an automatic kind of adjustment over time. They are capturing just the frontier and not the bigger kind of swath of broader technologies. Remains to be seen, I think, how it actually works. There's sort of tons of enforcement questions here we need to get into. but it's at least an interesting way to sort of say, we're going to keep with this idea of we're only controlling the frontier and allowing broader models to continue to trade.
And I will say, an aspect of this that makes a ton of sense is that ratcheting effect, particularly if we see open source models developed outside of the US. And so it's worth noting that right now, the most capable open source model is from a Chinese company, DeepSeek. They kind of came out of the blue and developed this really effective open source model that they released. And it's clear that they have an impressive concentration of leading AI researchers. I think some open questions about down the road, whether they'll be able to continue that. They've been pretty open that compute is a big limitation for them. And as we see the export controls over time ideally have more effect, as industry keeps advancing to more chips and the threshold stays the same, that may be a bigger constraint on their ability to keep up. But that aspect of it makes all the sense in the world, that if a Chinese company releases an open source model, look, cat's out of the bag,
Yeah.
There's no point in holding others back from doing the same.
So how does this connect with, Paul, what you were talking about earlier around inference chips, right? So like they picked a threshold here that's based on just like raw performance power. Does that change if there's a shift in the technology towards more of this inference-based?
Yes, I think you're going to have to see an update to the export controls that move the performance threshold to cover more inference-optimized chips like the H20. And this is, I think, just part of the fact that despite moving as fast as the speed of government can, there is still a time lag, and the technology is moving very, very quickly. And so it's going to take a little bit of time for government to catch up. And of course, the downside is every time we do this, there is a lot of chips that get sold in the interim, right? So say this, what we saw with the first regulation that came out in 2022 is there were some obvious places where there were some loopholes, and NVIDIA responded and released new chips as a result. And then by the time the U.S. gets another regulation out a year later, well, a bunch of those chips have already shipped to China. And so that is a challenge, is how do you find ways to allow the government to move faster, acknowledging that these are contentious things, and it is constructive to have debates among government and allow industry, at least informally, to weigh in on a lot of what's happening.
So I do want to talk about this timing question, because in one respect, the Biden administration released this rule because they have how many hours left in the administration? They've been working on it, right? So that explains the timing a little bit here. In terms of why it's urgent to come out now. Obviously, if you talk to them, kind of the more sober rationale that you'll hear is again, this belief that the next 2 to 5 years is really, really, really critical when it comes to who's going to be the global leader in AI. So you have to get a rule like this out now and kind of make the bet on U.S. technology and U.S. leadership now. But Paul, I particularly wanted to get your thoughts on this, because when the initial round of controls came out in October 2022, you had some thinking that maybe we had shot our shot a little bit too soon. We have this immense leverage, but when we use that leverage really matters. That's actually something that we think a lot about in the context of in a totally different line of research when we look at sanctions against China and a Taiwan contingency. We have a modest amount of leverage. When we use it, it's actually going to be almost as important as the leverage itself. So what was your argument back then, and did you change your mind?
Yeah, no, good question. I think my concern has always been that if we move too quickly or too early or move too aggressively in export controls, that we're able to have only a temporary effect. And then we can end up in a place where 5-10 years down the road, we've incentivized the creation of this whole chip ecosystem that is dominated by China, that's outside of U.S. export controls, that doesn't rely on U.S. technology, we have no control over them. And meanwhile, AI is still getting better, because it's not like we get to 2027 or 2030 and then geopolitical competition with China stops, right. Or AI stops developing. Maybe, but probably not. And so we could end up in a place where, in practice, the 2030s may be even more consequential in terms of AI applications in national security, in society, than this time period right now, where we're seeing a lot of fundamental progress in research. And so how do you make sure that these effects are sustainable? I do think that one thing that has certainly justified moving faster on chips is we've seen a lot of progress in AI in the last 2 years, more than I was, frankly, I was expecting. I mean, I think there were things that we were seeing now in the last couple of years that I assume we got to eventually, but I figured might be 5 to 10 years down the road. And that, I think, puts an incentive on moving fast. The other thing is, at least so far, and we'll see how this plays out, is we haven't seen the development of Chinese chips that are serious competitors to the NVIDIA chips. And there was a lot of concern a year and a half ago about this Huawei 7 nanometer chip that SMIC had made, and maybe there's a way around some of these export controls. And I think what we've seen is that hasn't really panned out, at least in a significant way, for AI chips. There's some interesting work that Leonard Heim of RAND has done looking at Chinese AI models that are part of Epoch's sort of notable AI model data set. So Epoch has built up a data set of over 200 really significant AI models. Of those, 33 of those are Chinese, and only 2 of those Chinese models are using Chinese chips, the Huawei set. And there are no notable non-Chinese AI models that use these Chinese chips. But I think, 5 years from now, is that still the case? And that's a big risk here with pushing so hard on these export controls.
Yeah, I mean, I keep thinking about this whole export control strategy as kind of a bet or a gamble, right? Like, there is a reason to take a policy action now. The outgoing Biden team has taken some really big swings on this, and there's a rationale to do it. There's an argument to do it the way they've done it at the time they've done it, right? They really believe that like the next couple of years are going to be super critical. We've got this leverage. We have to kind of double down on that now. I don't think they're unaware of the downside risk, but it seems like it's kind of a strategic calculus that the benefits of the payoff of these sorts of bets that they're making in the policy space outweigh the potential downside risk.
Well, that's the bet. Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah.
And I mean,
so answer it. Paul, just answer. Did it work?
Is it going to work? I think the big question is, again, 5-10 years down the road, where we are. But also, I think it's worth acknowledging that even if these bets pay off, what we're buying is, in effect, only a brief window of time of AI leadership. In part because algorithmic breakthroughs proliferate very rapidly, other chips are continuing to advance, and so even if the US is able to effectively constrain China's chip development and keep this in the US in the lead on chips and on AI development, you're talking about maybe an advantage in single-digit years. 2-3 years. Maybe if things play out well, you're talking about 5 years of US leadership and the outside. But I don't think more beyond that. These capabilities will proliferate to others. And so, if the goal here is like, okay, the US gets a 2-year head start on China in the use of the most advanced AI capabilities for cybersecurity. That could be really valuable.
Yeah, right? It seems like it.
That would be really significant. That would be a nice edge to have. But the flip side of it is we've got to exploit that advantage then. Like, okay, is the Defense Department and the intelligence community really staying close enough to the frontier of AI so that it's capitalizing on that? And if we have a situation where, sure, the leading US labs are 2 years ahead of Chinese competitors, but the Defense Department is 10 years behind the private sector. I don't know what that adds up to, right? So we've got to find ways to make sure that we're capitalizing on this lead.
Yeah, I think that basically adds up to the current state of our U.S. industrial base, but that's another podcast.
I do want to add here a little bit, because I do think the focus of the diffusion rule and making it a global regime also really matters here. Where all right, so we have this brief window that we're going to be in the lead in advance of China. How are we using that to talk to other countries? Because I think, again, this goes back to sort of, are we restricting or diffusing, actual capabilities here? And my sense of this is that I think, the regime makes a lot of sense. I think I kind of fully agree. The sort of 2-year lead on cybersecurity over China makes a lot of sense. But we also need a long-term plan to kind of pull other countries into the U.S. tech orbit. And I do worry that, again, sort of stepping away from the kind of specific, who's buying H100s, again, it's a relatively limited set, but there's a broader narrative out there that China does a good job of making it easier and easier to do business with Chinese tech companies, and the US is making it harder and harder to do business with US tech companies. And that the US is sort of on this path where we keep on, again, for kind of good reasons, as we see new capabilities, we're sort of expanding the set of technology that needs to be controlled. But there's a reasonable viewpoint from other countries to look at that and say, well, the U.S. now has this like long track record of like saying, no, we're taking this away, no, we're taking this away, no, we're taking this away from you. What's the logical endpoint of that? And if you are Brazil, India, Singapore, Malaysia, let alone, frankly, a sort of Poland in this world, how much do you look at this and say, actually, the United States is making it harder for me to be part of that tech ecosystem, and the kind of, I can sign up to the Belt and Road and get a free Huawei data center, maybe I'll just do that instead.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like, if we're making countries choose between the US and China, we clearly need a much more proactive agenda diplomatically, where we're offering countries something for opting into the US tech ecosystem that we just haven't seen to date. And I do think that there's a strong case to be made that while it makes sense for the US to initially start unilaterally here, that gives us the freedom to move out and what we think is necessary, to find ways to multilateralize this down the road, or you risk it not being sustainable. And that's probably what you're going to need, is some kind of multilateral regime for this to actually remain effective in the long term.
Yeah, I'll say I think that's my kind of high-level takeaway from this, that some type of regime like this makes sense, but you need to actually put it into a real global governance system, which would mean having actual kind of country criteria for how you get into tier one or not, having actual sort of decision-making processes to kind of bring in other partners and allies. And we'll be curious to see. I think, the Trump team's not going to come in inclined towards making this multilateral system, but I do think there's a real logic to say, over the long run, to kind of have this have legitimacy and to bring other partners, kind of get buy-in from, at least our closest allies and partners, and sort of ideally, hopefully, broader Global South coalition. You want to make this an actual regime with more clarity and more kind of buy-in from others on it.
So diplomatically, this is obviously going to be very complicated. Even if we are not in a transition point, we've already seen pushback from allies. The European Union, not surprisingly, given that half of their members were left out of the rule, has expressed concern. Industry is pushing back in various degrees of loudness and crankiness on this rule as well. But we've been talking about, this play and it could work out and how much time it's going to buy us. But that kind of assumes that it's implemented perfectly. And it's just an enormously complicated rule. We're talking about these country caps and allocations. I think to keep those levels at the right balance of letting enough out to encourage people to stay in the US tech ecosystem, you're going to need to have a really good monitoring program to figure out, are those caps in the right place? Do we need to move them? Who's receiving all of these certifications and notifications that are required? It's just a huge resource lift, right? We already know that BIS is stressed when it comes to resources. We already know that there are enforcement challenges, whether it's in the context of microelectronics going to Russia when they shouldn't be, or even advanced NVIDIA chips going to China when they shouldn't be, right? So how do we think about that aspect of it, right? Beautiful, glorious policy on paper, does any of it actually work in practice?
Yeah, no, it's huge. I think we've been,
Also, I hope nobody quotes me on that specific line of beautiful.
Very cool. Write this down. Exactly.
Just to confirm, that was sarcastic. All right, go ahead.
No, I think, look, we've been beating this drum for a long time here, saying sort of, BS is being asked to do more and more and not given resources to do it. And then, since we said that the last time, there have been 8 new rules, 200 pages each, that have dropped of new things for BIS to do, right? So I think it's a huge concern. It's going to be, again, we've heard the complaints from Republicans for a long time that kind of enforcement and monitoring compliance issues at BIS are not good enough. I think it'll be interesting to see, now that they have kind of power, is this something that they actually want to invest in to kind of build up that capability? But no, I think, going back to this question of sort of, ultimately, is this big bet going to work or not? So much is going to depend on how smoothly can the sort of basic paperwork processes that we've kind of, layered on top of each other here, who's actually taking in the request to become a validated end user? How quickly are they turning them around? Who's checking? Are these end users, doing all of the sort of myriad security compliance things they've signed on to do? There's a massive kind of bureaucratic capacity question here that I think, up until now has been a gap, and the kind of gap is only getting bigger as more and more rules come out.
I think one of the things to keep in mind is that we have for a lot of these regulations very carefully calibrated rules and all of these exceptions. But in practice, a lot of these regulations end up being really blunt instruments. They're leaky, people are finding ways to get around them. Sometimes people overcorrect, industry responds. And so it's like, oftentimes in think tank land where we inhabit, people say, well, we need to use a scalpel, not a hammer. Sometimes policymakers only have hammers. They have these really blunt instruments. And I think one of the challenges of a rule like this is you can risk getting too clever of trying to carve out all these exceptions. And then if you don't have actually the ability to enforce that in a viable way, you can have a lot of second and third order effects. It's not what you want.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with that. I think, I've written on this, and one of the challenges in the sort of small yard, high fence paradigm that the Biden administration has tried to do is sort of, we're going to take the scalpel, we're going to kind of, carve in this chip and carve out that chip. And what that means is that it takes, 6 months to a year to write a new regulation. In that time, kind of the world has moved on, and then you're sort of stuck scrambling and sort of always a little bit on the back foot. So I think, maybe kind of coming in a bit blunter makes sense, but I still think the capacity questions are going to be hard.
Yeah, it's worth noting that one of the other rules that came out from Commerce this week was actually around some of these enforcement issues. So last summer, there was this reporting around TSMC shipping or fabricating chips for Huawei in violation of the existing export control rules. There's obviously been a lot of coordination with TSMC. It's a hugely sensitive issue, right? Like if we have concerns about TSMC and export control compliance, like we are just totally toast when it comes to all of this, right? Like they're making the vast majority of all of our advanced chips. And even domestically, we are putting a lot of hope in the fact that they can build out domestic capacity for advanced chips as well. So if they're not complying with export controls, like not great. Yeah. So we saw another rule that came out this week that's really trying to enhance compliance because of some of those violations that were reported to occur at TSMC last summer. So putting in a lot more restrictions for foundries to make sure that at the most advanced nodes, they actually have their act together when it comes to making sure they know who they are selling to and giving the US government more oversight over that sort of kind of contract manufacturer relationship, particularly when it comes to China.
Yeah, I think, again, another sort of onus on the BIS team to kind of carry out this new rule. One thing that I do think is interesting on it is we've seen, again, since the original October 22 rules, where you have, sort of seen what looks like evidence of violations or evasion or kind of loopholes. I think there's some gray areas there. But what we haven't actually seen BIS do is come out and start levying massive fines against any of these actors here. And it seems like in response to these sort of evasions and violations of the rules, instead of taking a kind of enforcement approach of just kind of going after them and finding them, we're sort of building additional rules on top to try and kind of close the loophole and then close the loophole created by the other loophole. And it's sort of like a very complicated arcane system where I do wonder a little bit, to kind of going back to being blunter, if you just start levying some massive fines, that may actually shift company behavior in a way that sort of another 200-page rule doesn't quite get you there.
The other question is, so we're averaging one rule a day for the Biden team in the last week. Any speculations on we get any more AI rules in the last couple waning hours of the team?
Yeah, the pace has been pretty amazing. These aren't coming out of nowhere, right? Like this stuff they've been building this policy for a while, and like there's a pretty hard deadline that they need to meet at this point. But it is a good question, right, on transition. Obviously, this is a huge new program to leave for a new administration. The Biden team has kind of teed this up so that the new team will have a chance to shape it, right? So it came out as an interim final rule, but there's a comment period. The Trump team will have an opportunity to come in and update or amend the rule. I guess, like in theory, they could roll it back. Candidly, I have a hard time seeing why a Trump administration would want to fully remove this rule. It hits a lot of their anti-China objectives. It hits a lot of their domestic manufacturing and America First kind of objectives. What do you guys think? Do you think this kind of survives into the next administration?
I think if we look at the last several years of U.S.-China tech competition and U.S. restrictions on technology going to China, starting with the first Trump administration and then through Biden, it's been this steady ratcheting effect of greater and greater restrictions. And every time there's a human cry from industry if they can't do this, and this is outrageous. And then we see like that doesn't actually hurt their bottom line that much, and Nvidia stock is through the roof. And so with all things Trump, I mean, a lot of wild cards at play, but I think it would be really notable if we started to see the pendulum swing the other way and people started to dial back restrictions. Because it's not about domestic regulation. This is all about keeping U.S. tech out of China's hands. It's very solidly an America First strategy. And so, you know, President Trump is not afraid to play hardball with close allies and other countries. That's not something he's shying away from in other areas like tariffs. So I think there's actually a lot that aligns with the priorities of the incoming team.
Yeah, I think that seems right to me. I think, you know, it's an interesting issue set here where you see it cutting across the aisle on both sides. You see it's kind of, you know, both many Republicans and Democrats coming out in support of this, and certainly a select committee on China kind of strongly in support of it. You know, so see some senators maybe more aligned with industry kind of raising concerns about it. Again, I find it hard to believe there'd be a kind of full-scale rollback of it, if only because if you did that, the question would be like, all right, what would you put in place instead? Right? I think it's hard to do this and not come up with some other answer. So again, certainly, you know, we have the comment period out now. I can easily imagine there being tweaks, maybe some of the thresholds move a bit or not. I know the diplomatic lobbying for who's in tier 1 has already kicked off. And I think that will be intense over the next 3 months. But the kind of broad scope of this, I think, makes sense. Again, the big question for me is sort of, you know, if this is the de facto global regime for controlling the spread of AI, how do we actually sort of build that out into something more permanent and long-lasting that is a kind of real institution, a kind of multilateral base, and not just a BIS rule as it is?
Yeah, so last question for us as we wrap up. I mean, it's really easy to kind of nitpick at these sorts of rules and critique them, as we've spent the last hour or so doing. It's much harder when you're in that policymaker seat and you feel like you have to do something. So if you guys were in government and the president said, I need to do something about this AI policy, like, was this the right move right now? What do you think?
I think the broad structure of it makes sense to me. The things that I would like to see changed, again, I think I would want to move this into a actual multilateral organization. I'd want to sort of like bring in our close partners and allies.
When?
It's hard. And again, like maybe this is the like move to that. I don't know exactly how it gets. I think, look, there's, you know, lots of reporting on how time consuming and at times frustrating the discussions with the Japanese and the Dutch were on the tooling controls. I don't know if that kind of shaped the decision to just say, we'll just do this one unilaterally and kind of see what happens from it. But ultimately, I think, you know, the related thing that I think we just see was what I mentioned here is that we need that sort of the carrots, the promote side to go along to other countries and say, all right, here's the actual incentive for signing up for this. So I think building those two things in is how you kind of actually make a broadly legitimate system for sort of advancing U.S. and allied tech and ensuring that it continues to lead against China. So I think that's where it should go. If this is sort of the first step towards that, I think that can work. But I do think this risk that over the long term, this is going to be interpreted as the U.S. just hoarding its tech and not having anything for, you know, our allies and partners, let alone the global south, is a real risk.
Paul, what about you? What's your bottom line?
Yeah, I think I agree with Geoff that this is a step in the right direction towards a global regime for computing hardware, which we absolutely need. If AI is going to continue to develop on the trajectory that it has been and have the kinds of capabilities, the kinds of opportunities, but also risks that, frankly, the leading AI companies are saying is their business model, what they're trying to get to, then we're going to have to regulate the hardware that's absolutely essential as kind of this input into the systems. But I think we got to get towards a multilateral regime down the road, and so that means working to build something that follows this with close allies and partners to figure out, okay, how do we have something that's more cooperative? And at the sort of base level of the technology, look, there's only a couple players that are actually key here. It's us, Japan, and the Netherlands. And, you know, I think we want to get to a place where the kind of that core group of a effectively compute suppliers club is then setting the terms for other countries that are building foundries and who gets access to chips and data centers and sort of standards that people need to meet to get access to the most leading edge chips. And eventually that needs to move up into actually the training and application layer that we don't have now, right? That there's just not any kind of agreement, even among the leading labs, about, well, how do we make an AI system safe? in a way that's robust and reliable. But that's got to be a component eventually too, so that we can say, just like we have, frankly, for things like international air travel, there's a set of standards for this is what safe looks like. And that can then unlock more of these benefits for AI for other countries.
Emily, what's your final take on it?
I was not going to make myself answer.
Dodge that question.
That's why I asked the question. So I am very empathetic to why the administration felt like the U.S. needed to move first and to move now. I mean, I think when you look across the range of economic security actions that we've seen over the last years, like nothing starts at the multilateral level, right? Like we started on outbound first, hoping and pushing other countries to follow. We started on the initial tooling controls first and then got others to follow. Even on broader CFIUS issues, we started that 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago first, and then got others to follow. I mean, I think the unfortunate reality is if the US doesn't show leadership, show that we've got skin in the game and that we're willing to take these big swings, you could go years without having a solution. Like an example of that is like all the talk we've had about trying to address Chinese subsidies and non-market practice. Like those conversations languish. Like there's no real answer there. I mean, one of the things about doing this stuff in the tech space and the export control space is we do have these really strong domestic authorities that we can leverage. We've got the kind of the technology and economic leverage to do this. And so I think if you're in that policymaker seat and you have to do something, I am very sympathetic to why they went now, and then they'll just figure out how to manage all those downside risks later. Hopefully, yeah. Well, yeah. All right. Paul, this has been great. I've learned so much just sitting and talking with you, as always. To wrap us up, our favorite last question for guests is, what is a good book or podcast or other piece of content that you would recommend for our listeners?
I'm going to recommend something maybe a little novel. I would recommend people check out the work of Epoch. It's a research organization that does some very interesting, very compelling quantitative research on AI trends. They're looking at the models that are being developed, the computing power that goes into them, the trends in how it's developing. I think things are moving so fast, and it's essential that policymakers, and really anyone else who's interested in this topic, have a tangible sense of what's actually occurring. And there's a lot of noise out there. I mean, if you're just reading sort of news articles, at any given day of the week, we've either achieved super intelligence or deep learning has hit a wall and it's all bunk. And like, there's just a little bit in between those two. And you know what's amazing? Data. Data is great. Epoch is doing great work. Please check them out. Go to their website, take a look at the work that they're doing, because I think it really just helps people to be informed. It's epoch.ai.
Fantastic. Well, we will put that link in the show notes, as well as links to some of your recent writing on this, Paul, as well as your book. And again, thanks so much for joining us. This has been great.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to De-Risky Business, an economic security podcast from the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Have any questions or comments? Get in touch at deriskybusiness@cnas.org. The nerdier, the better. And find us wherever you get your podcasts every other